morning and welcome to Social Venture Partners Dallas and to our Responds series. If you are if you are an audience member returning to one of our sessions in this series, we welcome you back. If this is your first time to listen to one of our sessions, welcome. Social Venture Partners Dallas is a philanthropic organization made up of men and women who bring their time, their talent, and their financial resources to work with organizations and help them grow the capacity, the business side of their social enterprise. Several years ago, our board made an intentional and deliberate decision to move towards working with organizations that have a shot or a chance at making systemic change reform. We understand that underneath most of what ails society is racism. And racism leads to poverty. And so as a philanthropic organization, we are working with those organizations that have some hope, some theory of change, some work that provides some chance of reconciling the race issues and changing the systems that lead to poverty and lead to marginalized communities suffering even more than they have in the past. So today we are in our second of a series, which is criminal justice, and we're looking at the reforms that are possible there. Our first session last week around that was with our DA and our chief of police. And today we welcome public defenders who are responding to the issue as well. I want to thank one of our partners, Giles Davidson, for helping me pull this panel together, to our sponsor, Something Good Consulting, to Forward DFW for helping us get the message out. I'd like to introduce our panel at this time. I'd like to introduce Lynn Pride Richardson, who serves as the Chief Public Defender here in Dallas County at the Public Defender's Office. We welcome you, Lynn. James Foreman Jr., who is a professor at Yale, coming to us from New Haven today, a law professor, and has written a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own. We welcome you back to the North Texas region as well. You were kind enough, James, to be with us for Big Bang a couple of years ago, our social impact conference, and we are grateful to have you back. We also welcome Jonathan Rapping, founder, president of Gideon's Promise, who is coming to us from Atlanta today. And you too were on the Big Bang stage with us a couple of years ago, and so we are also grateful to have you back as well. Lynn, I'm going to throw the first question today to you. You know, I must admit myself that there was a lot about the Public Defender's Office that I did not know. My research has really taught me a lot these last few days, but I was hoping that you might give our audience an overview of what your role is and what your office does. So I'm going to turn it to you, Lynn, to respond to that. And I think you might have to go off mute there for a second and get started. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And good morning to everyone. Just a little bit about the office. The office is the largest public defender office of its kind in the entire state of Texas. It is the second oldest. It was created in 1983 by the Dallas County Commissioner's Court. And it started off with a staff of 8 lawyers, 2 investigators, 1 interpreter, 2 secretaries, and 1 receptionist. Right now it has grown to a staff of 132 individuals and 93 lawyers. When the office was first created, it only worked in a couple of courts because they were trying it out. And there were some judges that were not sold on the use of public defenders, because here in the state of Texas, you have the opportunity, or judges have the opportunity, to either appoint public defenders or private attorneys who do court appointments for the county and are paid for their cases on an individual basis. So it started off with a small group of lawyers, and eventually it grew to how we exist and the number of people we have today. Again, we have a staff of about 132 employees, and our proposed budget for 2020 is over $16 million. 14 misdemeanor attorneys with 2 supervising attorneys assigned to 11 adult misdemeanor county courts. We have 30 felony attorneys, 4 of whom are felony supervisors assigned to 15 adult felony district courts. We have 5 attorneys in our appellate division. We have 3 lead attorneys in our capital murder division, who also work with the other attorneys in the office and train young lawyers who are interested in doing capital work. We have 9 lawyers in a mental health division and 5 case managers. This is a division that was started back in 2006 with funding from the Indigent Defense Commission, Texas Indigent Defense Commission, and the Dallas County Commissioners Court. Basically, the funding was for 1 attorney and for 2 case managers. We now have 9 attorneys that work in that division, specifically working with the mentally ill. We discovered as far back as 2000 that a significant number of individuals in our Dallas County Jail, by the way, which is the 2nd largest jail in the state, and I believe the 6th largest, 6th or 7th in the nation. At any one time, we have at least a little less than 5,000 inmates over in the jail. At our highest point, it costs Dallas County literally $11 million a month to operate that jail. And so there's always a focus on trying to reduce the jail population. 70% of the Dallas County budget is related to the courts, indigent defense, the operation of the jail, the sheriff's department. That's a huge amount of money that's dedicated towards the operation of criminal justice. Some of the other positions we have an immigration attorney. We have attorneys who staff the numerous specialty courts. Since we're limited in time, I'm not going to go through all of those courts, but we have a number of courts and dockets. And the whole purpose of those programs, and in line with criminal justice reform, instead of sending people to prison, is diverting individuals from prison into programs to get them services, resources, if they're mentally ill, the medication that they need, the services that they need, if there's substance use disorders, to treatment for that. Youthful offender program, we have DWI court programs, we have programs that deal with those who have been living a life of prostitution. But the really exciting thing about it is, number one, the goal is to try to get them hooked up and get them the help they need so that they don't continue to come back over and over again. In the very beginning of our quest for these diversion programs, we got a lot of pushback from a lot of individuals, including defense attorneys, who would say, it's not my job to get somebody mental health treatment. It's not my job to ensure that they get substance use disorder treatment. In fact, to be honest with you, it kind of digs into a person's pocketbook. If you're out and your business is, you're a defense attorney, you don't want people to stop coming in and out of the system over and over again. There's value to people reoffending over and over again, and there are attorneys that represent families and generations in the system. But that's the value and the beauty of having an office of defenders who are committed to getting and giving good outcomes for our clients, because we've got to stop this revolving door. There are a number of other programs. Recently, a created bond division program. That's to try to get people out, low-level, nonviolent offenders, who of course are in the Dallas County Jail and haven't been convicted of anything yet, to try to get them released on personal recognizance bonds, or even to get their bond amount lowered to something that's more reasonable so they can get out. Of course, COVID-19 just interfered with the whole operation of the courts and criminal justice for all of us throughout the country. And our focus in the very beginning of the pandemic was to ensure that we get people, as many people out as we possibly can. And so I have to compliment our wonderful bond division and the attorneys in the court that worked really hard to get those individuals out of jail. We also worked with organizations, and that's another big piece that our office focuses on, our contacts with people in the community, advocates in the community. We couldn't do the work that we do, and we couldn't have the outcomes that we have if we didn't partner with others out there. In terms of getting people out of jail and getting them out of jail as quickly as possible for those who can't make bond, we've partnered with some local groups, Texas Organizing Project, and also Faith in Texas, that have bail funds. So if we get the bond lowered and they still can't get out, then we reach out to them, and they've been very good partners for us. We have 17 investigators in the office. Can't say enough about them. They are incredible. We talk about a lot of times parity between the defense and the prosecution. We have 17. I believe the Dallas County District Attorney's Office has like 60. So that tells you, the balance of that. But I have to say that our investigators work incredibly hard. We get cases dismissed, no bail, we get not guilty. We've even had instances where we had an investigator who works with the Capital Division was able to find out the person who actually committed the crime of capital murder, which resulted in the freedom of our client. But basically, he did the work of the police department. They work very hard, and we're very fortunate to have them in the office. One of the divisions that we're most proud of, although I'm proud of every single attorney in this office, is our DNA exoneration division. And I have to say that over half of the exonerations that have occurred in Dallas County, we have been affiliated with and worked with those individuals. A couple of ones that I just wanted to highlight, you had individuals like Raymond Jackson, who was charged with aggravated sexual assault in November of 1983. Despite having numerous alibi witnesses, he was convicted in January 1984 and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Our office filed a motion for forensic DNA testing on behalf of Mr. Jackson, and in September 2011, Mr. Jackson was excluded as a possible donor, and he was freed after spending all that time in prison. Charged with a couple of counts of murder. We have client after client, many of them who spent in excess of 25 or 30 years in prison, but for our representation. And I'd like to add, out of all of those exonerations, none of those individuals were represented in trial by public defenders. And so we're real proud of all the work that we do. There are challenges, there are always challenges. Again, we see ourselves as client-centered. We were talking about being client-centered very early in the process. Now that's a buzzword for everyone. That means that we're not just lawyers, but we're social workers, although we have social workers and case managers on staff. But I believe in something that I've heard before about the necessity. I think it was Brian Stevenson that said that individuals in the system should have proximity. Okay, proximity to the people that they're working with. And it kind of goes in line with our connections and our ability, our desire to work with the community. I don't know how we can effectively represent people if we don't understand the circumstances where they're coming from. Obviously, as an African American female who grew up in a community that was very tight-knit, very progressive, but we saw the destruction of many Black communities back in the 70s, not just because of segregation, but because of the infiltration of drugs. And in order to correct those wrongs that were done and to improve upon those communities, we cannot ignore the fact that most of the people that we're representing are coming from those communities. And it really doesn't help if we're successful to get them at least their cases dismissed so that they don't have a conviction, or to get them from going to prison when they end up having to go back to the communities that are so fractured. We've got to go back and help those other individuals. So we're really proud of that. Challenges, what are the challenges? Caseloads in the adult criminal courts, of course, and you'll find this all over the country with public defenders, and John can certainly share that better than I can with the training that he does and the interaction with he has public defenders all over the country. But you just got to understand that caseloads are a problem. Luckily, we have other divisions within the office. We have a family law division. We have a juvenile division.
And I'm going to go ahead and interrupt you there, and we're going to swing over to John. And thank you for the overview of what we're doing here in Dallas County. And I'll be back to you with a few more questions.
All right.
As Lynn said, you are overseeing an organization that works with public defenders. Tell us a little bit about Gideon's Promise and what you're hoping to achieve through that.
Sure. Thank you, Tony, for inviting me to join you today. I think it's important to first point out that obviously there are uprisings happening all across the country, in Dallas and Atlanta, in New Haven, where James is. And I think we are finally reckoning with the fact that the reality is there are some lives that are less valuable. The Black Lives Matter movement is a movement that reminds us that some lives don't matter. And we see that when we look at videotapes of police killing Black and brown people in the streets. But I think it's important to also connect the violence that happens in the streets to violence that happens in courtrooms every day. There's sort of a routine violence that happens when people survive police encounters, as most of them do, and they are thrown into a criminal justice system that sees them as a case file and not a human being. And I think, as Lynn mentioned, Brian Stevenson does say that you can't do justice without proximity. Literally, public defenders are the vehicle through which judges, prosecutors, everyone in the system gets proximate to the people who they have to judge. It's through public defenders that we learn more than just the case. We learn about their mental illness, their substance abuse, that they're a father or mother, a sister or brother. So what Gideon's Promise really does is we are building a movement of public defenders all across the country, proud to partner with Lynn and the team in Dallas. It's a movement of public defenders across the country to change the way we view poor people, to change a narrative that sees some lives as invaluable. And I have to just say that I started my career along with James in Washington, D.C., in an office that really was a model public defender office. I don't think I really appreciated at the time how privileged I was to be a public defender with manageable caseloads, with resources needed to give every person the representation they deserved. I worked 7 days a week, sometimes 80 hours a week, but with that time, I could give everyone what they deserved. And then I moved to Georgia in 2004 to be part of an effort to build a statewide public defender system in Georgia for the first time. 2 years later, Katrina hit. I went to New Orleans to help rebuild the public defender office there. And I met these young public defenders who were passionate, who were smart, who were every bit as committed as the lawyers I knew in DC, but they would never be able to give the people they represented the representation they deserved, because they were thrown into systems that had come to accept this embarrassingly low standard of justice for poor people. And I saw these amazing lawyers who, if they could last more than 2, 3, 4 years, they would start to be shaped by these systems into lawyers they never would have recognized as law students. The culture would start to create public defenders who could be part of the problem sometimes without even realizing it. And so my wife and I, my wife was a teacher at the time, and I asked her to take a year off to help build Gideon's Promise. And 13 years later, she's the executive director, never went back to teaching. But if I had to sum up the goal of Gideon's Promise, it is to partner with public defender offices to first change the internal culture. So the staff in the office see themselves as allies to the people they serve and the communities they serve, and then ultimately build offices that can be the vehicles to drive culture change in the systems where they work. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as the program goes on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. James, I want to turn to you. When I was reading your book, Locking Up Our Own, the old saying kept coming back, to my mind. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and people get into the systems and they think they're doing the right thing to advance some particular mission and end up having all kinds of negative consequences that were not anticipated. What do you see in this time frame that we could learn from that, and so that in these criminal justice reform movements, folks aren't making the same mistakes?
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's a real honor to be on this call and in this conversation with Lynn and John. And I want to lift up the work that they're doing as public defenders and as trainers and culture builders, leading a public defender movement as John is doing. I think that you are right about this question of good intentions. I want to be clear, there's plenty of people out there that have bad intentions, and they help to produce the system as well. So let's not lose sight of that, because we have to resist that. But for the good intentioned folk, the well-intentioned folk, and I do think we are seeing a rising up of more and more of those people in this conversation, what lessons can history teach us for those folks? And I think the first thing, actually both Lynn and John mentioned it, but it's the necessity of listening to those that are most directly affected by the system. You cannot have any conversation about the change that we need in this country without listening to the people that are being brutalized and being harmed by current systems. And I think that this moment that we're in right now is, in a way, the first moment in my lifetime where I think that a broader swath of America is doing precisely that, is bearing witness to how a lot of Black citizens have been suffering. These things that are in the news aren't news to Black people. But segregation wasn't news to Black people before Birmingham and Bull Connor. Segregation wasn't news to Black people before the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But what happened was folks protested, that produced this violent reaction that was broadcast on the media, and the rest of America, non-Black America, said, oh my goodness, I can't believe what's happening. And then some of them stood up and decided to fight back. Now, the other thing I want to say, advice for those well-intentioned people, is it's really crucial that you be willing to be uncomfortable. When you have these conversations with the folks that are directly affected, you're going to hear some things that are going to be challenging to you. They're going to be challenging to your worldview. They're going to be challenging to the status quo. And our natural instinct as humans, when we hear something like that, is to kind of resist. And we want to look for the idea that most fits what we already believe. And what I really want to encourage people to do is to not do that, to be willing to be uncomfortable and to be willing to consider and maybe run towards one of those provocative ideas that may not be what you believe right now. And the last thing that I'll say in terms of ideas of advice for the well-intentioned people that are joining this movement now for the first time is, don't be afraid to be unpopular. Please understand that if you are actually fighting for justice, if you are actually pushing the boundaries, you will be unpopular. You will only become popular later in history when we look back and we say, aha, you were at the cutting edge. But don't please never forget that Martin Luther King was deeply unpopular in his lifetime. The civil rights movement was deeply unpopular when it was happening. Colin Kaepernick was reviled just a few years ago for basic nonviolent protests. So when it's happening, you are gonna maybe lose some friends. You gotta be willing to do that if you really are going to be a fighter for justice, and just know that your children and your grandchildren will one day thank you the same way I thank my mother and my father for the sacrifices they made in the 1960s.
Thank you so much. Lynn, I want to turn it back to you and ask you specifically what here locally changes you think are necessary that could be immediate, that could change some of the systems that are harming men and women of color here in our local community.
I think we're on the right path with the specialty diversion programs, keeping people from getting convictions on their record, getting those convictions, if they have convictions, expunged, getting them the resources. But something that James was saying, with well-intentioned people who head up these programs, you gotta be willing to get down deep and dirty and do the hard work. When people are running for a bench or for an elected position and they go into communities of color, the communities enjoy hearing about these special programs. Yes, you have a program for youthful offenders to keep them from going to prison. Yes, you have this great program to help the homeless. But what happens is that those programs are started, but there's no effort to really do the science, to do the research, to look into the best practices, to look at the outcomes. And I think sometimes it's because people are afraid of what they may find. In my opinion, it's better to know whether your program is working or not, or what is working and what's not working so you can correct it, first of all. And number two, I don't know how you can operate a program and you don't know the outcomes. You know, if the purpose of these programs is to prevent people from going out and committing crimes again and moving on with their lives and being productive citizens, then you've got to evaluate and assess these programs to see what works and what doesn't work. You've got to do the research. You absolutely do. And what happens is, and you have a lot of fine judges in Dallas County who are doing that, but you have some court programs that are just not going far enough. And when you're dealing with elected officials and then they come back to see you when it's time to get reelected, then the people in the community, and it's incumbent upon people like the folk in that are basically on this panel to let people know that you've got to hold these people accountable. Ask them the questions. That's a lovely program, but how many people are successfully completing the program? How many people did not successfully complete it? How many people have failed to reoffend the 6 months out, 1 year out? When we do that, and we can look at hard data and evidence that these programs are working, and I think many of them are, but you've got to be able to show it, and then it helps us to determine, how we can do a better job. And again, as James said, I don't know how you do that unless you have this kind of relationship with the people in the program. We have got to get away from seeing people in the system as widgets on a conveyor belt, and you just move them in and out and in and out. We've got to look at them individually, because you never know what some of those individuals can do in the future. And you're making a change not only on that individual's life, but their families and their communities as well. So that's a biggie for me. Luckily, I live in Dallas County that is willing to do this. And I know a lot of other areas don't have those kinds of programs, are just starting it. But to me, we're on the right track, but we've got to go further with that.
So thank you, Lynn. So John, we hear from James about the having the personal courage to stand up to some of these systemic racist issues. We hear from Lynn about how important data is to prove which program is best and which isn't. I want to go a little deeper, and I want you to talk a little bit about, in a TED Talk, you said, a culture of indifference defines criminal justice in America. There's a common phrase that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. We can have the great data, we can have all the best intentions, we can have real moral conviction, but when we're up against cultures that are built against certain people to favor others, there's hardly any hope. What do you see as hope for changing some of these entrenched cultures that really hurt marginalized communities?
Yeah, so Tony, I agree with everything you said, except there's hardly any hope. I feel fortunate because I'm literally surrounded every day by courageous, heroic public defenders who give me hope. I want to share a story and then pivot back to the answer, but it's a story that I think really reflects the indifference that you mentioned. And this happens all over the country, but this is a story out of Tennessee. There was a videotape I saw once where there was a man who was the elected spokesperson for the public defenders in Tennessee. He was the president of the Tennessee Public Defender Commission. And he was at a budget hearing representing public defenders. And he was asked, do you have enough resources? He said, let me tell you something. I have a 5-county district. I have 5 courthouses, 5 lawyers, 1 investigator. And last year we closed 4,000 cases. That's 800 cases per lawyer. He went on to say, so let me assure you, there is 1 district in Tennessee that has enough. We're blessed. He went on to say, we're blessed to have staff that are seasoned. That means they're good at processing. They're efficient. They are time savers. Literally, these were the adjectives he used with pride to describe the lawyers who worked with him. And I share that with public defenders all the time. And I say, I don't believe that man came out of law school 30 years ago saying, you know what I want to do with my life? I want to help process 800 people a year into cages. I think I'll become a public defender. I don't believe that. I believe he was very slowly and subtly shaped over 30 years by a system that had come to think that was all the justice poor people deserved. He was shaped into a lawyer he would have never recognized as a young, recent law graduate. And again, that's not a story about Tennessee. That happens all over the country. It happens to good people who go into this work for the right reasons. But we get into systems where the culture teaches us that justice is the same as efficient processing of cases. They're not even human beings, they're cases into cages. And so really, when we built Gideon's Promise, it was because we realized funding was an issue. We realized there were structural challenges. But what we fundamentally realized was that you could fix all of those things. And if we didn't change a culture that caused people responsible for administering justice to think processing a lot of human beings quickly into a cage was justice, nothing else would matter. And what we recognized was that because public defenders literally represent 80% of the people in this country, in the criminal justice system, that if collectively public defenders can understand the obligation to learn stories, to share stories, to infuse the system with those stories and with that humanity, they can wake up judges, prosecutors, well-intentioned people who themselves have been shaped by a culture of indifference. And so I'm optimistic because I see public defenders now. We started in Atlanta and in New Orleans, and now we have partner offices in more than half the states. Over 1,000 public defenders are part of this community. We have a partnership with more than 500 public defenders in Maryland alone. And what those public defenders are saying is, it's not enough that we just represent individual people in individual cases. Collectively, we are going to partner with communities. We're going to learn what they need from the criminal justice system, and we are going to help amplify those voices in spaces where they're not allowed to speak. That's transformative. That's culture change. I believe we could do all the policy fixes we want, Tony, and I think many of them are important, right? We could end cash bail, we could cut sentences in half, but if we still despise poor people and people of color, we will not have a just system. Until we change that mindset, we can't have equal justice, and that mindset change comes from amplifying voices and stories that have been silenced for 400 years.
Thank you, John. James, John talks about the kind of mindset that needs to be changed. And when we look at systems as a whole, we understand that in order to change systems, you have to enter into the systems at multiple places. There are multiple levers that control the systems so that they stay in place and that they favor those that they were intended to favor in the first place. And in your book, you talk about African Americans who arrive at these positions of authority and leadership, and in many ways still find themselves playing into the way the system was set up. Here in Dallas County, most of the folks who are in positions of power in our criminal justice system, in our legal system here in Dallas County, are men and women of color. How do you, from your research and everything that you have experienced and what you've written about, what is your advice to them to be able to actually change these powerful systems that they are working within?
Thank you. Well, the first part of the answer is really highlighted by what you just heard, I think, from Lynn and from John, which is to say this point about the power of culture. And so if you're going to change the culture and the systems in your city, then you're going to have to bring in people like Lynn and John to help you do that work. So, right, that's number one. The other thing that I would say, though, is that my research for 50 years that I've been researched, the 50-year period that I researched where I looked at Black elected officials throughout all levels of government, one of the most consistent themes that I saw from the historical record and that I got from my interviews was over and over again, people said some version of, I don't really think the criminal justice system is the right way to deal with this problem, but I don't have any other alternatives. Police chiefs would say, I don't really want to lock up these folks with mental illness and addiction and these kids that really need jobs, but I'm a police chief and that's my toolkit. Prosecutors say, I don't really want to prosecute these people, but the police bring these cases to me and that's my job. I'm a prosecutor. That's my toolkit. That's what I have. I'm trying to create public safety and I'm a prosecutor. I'd really rather build a factory. I wish somebody would build a factory in this community, but I can't do that. So what do? I prosecute. right? In moments of self-reflection and candor, this is what I heard over and over and over again. So what I want to say now is this moment actually presents us with the opportunity to really take those comments seriously and say, okay, the protests, the murders have created an opening for us to say, well, what would it look like as a city if we seriously wanted to reduce the footprint of our criminal justice or criminal legal system 50%? Let's start there. I'd hope we could get bigger than that, but start with that. What would that look like? And in particular, what are the alternatives that we as a community would truly have to invest in and make excellent, right? So that we had less going into the criminal system. So part of it is the fixing the culture of whatever we have left, because there, as John said, we can do all that, but there's going to be something left. So what do we do with who's left? Yes. But why don't we radically shrink the size of the system? And the only way we're going to do that, the only way, is if you have a real conversation as a community in Dallas, in New Haven, in Atlanta, bring people together, philanthropy, government, everybody, and say, listen, we're cutting this criminal justice budget. I'm telling you right now, we cannot keep funding police and prosecutors in prison to this extent. We are going to be building the alternatives, the addiction services, the drug treatment programs, the job programs for kids, the mental health programs, right? In most communities, those have been starved to the bone. This is Lynn's point. If you walk in, there's a program on paper. There's programs on paper everywhere. But when you actually get there and you look at what's happening, is it high quality? Is it adequately and consistently funded? Do they have talented people? And those building up those alternative structures, I'm telling y'all, this is going to be hard work. I built a program for a school for young people in the juvenile justice system from the ground up, and it is not easy to be excellent, but we must, and we must require this across all of these spaces. So that would be my number one piece of advice to any community, would be to come together and figure out what is it going to take to build up these alternative structures so you can put people there rather than in the criminal system.
James, I'd like to stay with you for just a moment. Are you aware of any communities currently that are doing that well? Having those conversations and putting those initiatives in place?
I think that in Minneapolis is the one that I feel like I've seen the most, where they've made a commitment as a city to have this conversation. They've said that over the next year, they are going to come together as a city and have a whole series of conversations. I'm not on the ground in Minneapolis, so I don't know, how this is all started a month ago, right? This is brand new stuff. But they've made a commitment to completely reimagining, to ending their police department as it currently exists and reimagining it and rebuilding it from the ground up to be smaller and to be less violent. Now, they've started that conversation. What is going to come of it? I don't know. So no, I don't have any city that I could point to say, they have figured this out. But if I don't know if most of the people that are in your world are in Dallas, or if they're in other cities in Texas, or they're in national, but assuming that you have a disproportionate percentage of your audience that is Dallas, I would say Dallas should lead. Let Dallas be the city that a year from now, when Tony, you ask me or somebody else that question, I'll have an answer. And my answer will be Dallas.
Thank you. Lynn, how are we doing in Dallas? Are you aware of any big movements, any big initiatives to make Dallas a leading city in this kind of reform? If you can.
I'm waiting to see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was inspired by the protests. I'm hearing people say we got to do something, people that I haven't heard before. My opinion is that we've had this before. We can go back through our history. And there have been protests, there have been riots, there have been protests, there have been town hall meetings where people get to say what they want to say. And then committees, we always have advisory boards, committees that are formed, and then we don't go anywhere. And it's like, sometimes we come up with a strategic plan. Sometimes you can't come up with a strategic plan, or if you have a plan, you can't get everybody to buy into it. So the test will be what's going to happen moving forward, because finally we have the momentum behind this. Criminal justice reform has been a hot topic going back for about almost now 20 years almost, when we started talking about it, and James mentioned it, and it was brought about by people on both sides of the aisle because we couldn't afford to continue building prisons and to housing prisoners, and so we had to come up with another solution. And we have to be careful now that we're not switching from the prison system to over monitoring people in the community, but that's another story altogether. But we really are going to have to push ourselves to come up with some solutions and for us to see changes. And that's going to take, as James said, some really difficult work. And for those people that are not up to the challenge or get lip service to it, we're going to have to say, no, you're not part of this. If you're not going to be part of the change, when we don't need you here. The other thing too, as far as public defenders go, I always say to the people that are applying for jobs here, this job is not for everybody. If you're looking for a 9-to-5 job, this is not it. If you don't like dealing with aggressive, angry, distrustful people, then you don't need to work here. You may be a fine lawyer and you may work for some law firm where you represent white collar criminals, and some of them can be aggressive and not easy to work with. But as far as the caseloads that we have in the adult criminal courts, if that is something that you can't handle, then this is not the job for you, and that's okay. It's also okay, and this goes across the board. Maybe you're checking into, is this what I really want to do? So it's okay if you come here and you decide this is not for me. But again, you got to have committed people that are willing to do the hard work and are passionate about it. You can't have people that are saying, I just want a steady paycheck and I want to be able to get good insurance. That's why I'm with the public defender's office, so I don't hustle out there. The same thing with people across the board. What's the motivation for them being involved? Are they being involved because there's a camera in front of them? Or are they involved because they've got a history of doing this kind of community engagement work and making changes in the future? And you can see that. Or are they only interested in making a statement when somebody's watching them, or they've got some ultimate motive? So that's a lot.
The work is extremely hard, and John, I want to throw it to you. In our last few minutes, I want to go a little bit deeper than we're going, and I really want a response to this. Our DA ran on a criminal justice reform platform that he wasn't going to, arrest low-level crimes and that kind of thing, and not feed the system, right? And then when he got elected and put those things into practice, he was, really almost crucified over those kinds of changes. What I hear you all talking about is the public defender's role in helping the individual. What I still am not getting enough of is what changes the actual system so you all don't have to work so hard. Respond to that a little bit.
Yes. So first of all, I think when you point out a progressive prosecutor in Dallas or anywhere else who sort of points to being progressive by saying, I won't prosecute low-level drug offenders, right? That's part of the problem, is we have this idea that we have otherized too many people. And progressive is shrinking the universe of people who are otherized. And I think we really don't get to the kind of systems change you're talking about, Tony, until we truly embrace the idea that every person in the system is a human being, that no one should be otherized. And so I don't mean to sound like I'm resisting your question. I truly believe public defenders are the key to that systems reform, because it is public defenders who are the only vehicle that put context behind human beings who are otherized. So when James says we're finally starting to have these conversations in the wakes of the murders of George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, right? We've got cell phone video that starts conversations, and we start to learn that these are people who are children and parents, and they have families. And that starts to help us see these are human beings. This could have been me. We start to think about our own children, and we're mobilized to act. But in the criminal justice system, in the courts, right, that's still, there are no cameras. There's no one watching, and we process people as cases. And so I really do believe, Tony, that what we need to do is we need to find a way to take public defenders who largely are beaten down. They're heroic people, but with 300 cases and no resources, you start to get beaten down. You can start to find yourself processing. And we need resources so that we can partner with offices like Lynn's and make sure that the very passions that brought people into this work are maintained and fostered and fueled, and there's support, right? And we build that support so they really understand that they are the storytellers in this system that has remained untouched by a fervor for reform. Public defenders are not just processing cases, they are telling the stories of human beings. That's the key to culture change. And I truly believe if we really want to embark in systems reform, step one is we have to see everybody in the system as human beings, which means we have to hear those stories, which means we need public defenders. They are the only ones to interrupt the routine processing that happens in courts every day.
Thank you, John. James, any final thoughts or comments about the systems part of this? And also, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
And if you would, in our last few minutes, if you would just respond to that with any last comments, and then maybe talk a little bit about how this time period since COVID and the murder of George Floyd, how you have changed your thinking about things, if you have.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I would resist a little bit your characterization earlier that we haven't talked about systems. I mean, when I say changing budgets so that we cut by half the amount of money that's going into the criminal legal system and we put that money into alternatives, again, we maybe talk later about what systems change means, but to me that is system change. But maybe we're using the term differently. But other things that I would put on the table, if people want to change policing, for example, that system, the number one thing that I think we have to do, in addition to shrinking the role of police, is to have serious accountability measures. That means getting rid of qualified immunity. That means paying attention to contracts that are currently being negotiated, typically by mayors or county councils and the local police union, contracts which give almost all of the authority to discipline, to hire, to fire, to the police chief, so that no matter how many instances of bad behavior you have, you get kept on the force. Or if you get fired, you get hired by a neighboring police force. So I would say on the policing side, those are some of the accountability measures I think that would influence the system. In terms of my own thinking, I would say that the main change that has happened to me in the last month was the first 10 days after George Floyd was murdered. I just was in a deep funk and depression and was being deluged with requests for comments and couldn't even type my name, let alone do an interview. And then my son, who's 11, told me, we were driving around and he said, "Dad, how come we haven't gone to a protest?" And I really thought about that because we come from a family of protesters. He's raised in that. And here we were on day 11 and I had, day 10 or day 11, and I hadn't taken him to a protest. And I know the reason, COVID and such, but I was like, this can't go on. So we went down to the New Haven Green, and we saw down there, in a city of 100,000 people, there were 5,000 people on the New Haven Green, multiracial, multi-age, beautiful energy. And in fact, as we were walking down to the green, my son was like, yo, Dad, there's like a lot of white people walking down the New Haven Green. And I was like, yeah, that's great. And he was like, well, why is it great? And I was like, because Black people already know. So it's great that so many more people are joining in this march. So that moment, that march that I went on with him, moved me from the depression to a feeling of excitement and of inspiration and of belief that, you know, as Lynn said, it's true. We've been through these moments before, and this might end up looking like a moment, not a movement. But you never know in the beginning whether it's a movement. You don't know until later whether it turned into a movement. And this, to me, feels like it could be the beginning of something real and sustained and lasting if we all keep at it. So my biggest change in the last month has been exhilaration at seeing how many people are paying attention to Black humanity in a way that has not been true for much of my lifetime.
James, thank you so much for those words, and thank you for stepping into your own legacy and for now passing it on to a next generation. Yours has been an important voice in this work, and we appreciate all that you've contributed to it. And thank you for being with us today. Lynn, any final comments about how you've been changed over these last few months?
Just excited about the possibilities and hopeful for some change and for some hard work, and that people are serious about making changes.
Thank you. John, I'm going to ask you the same question for some follow-up there. Can you turn your mic on for us, John?
Yes. So I also am hopeful. I mean, I think the work that I do makes me realize that the forces that have led to all of these uprisings and protests and rallies were around 2 months ago. They'll be around 2 months from now. But it's exciting to see so many people stepping up. Like James, I have 2 children, and I see them stepping up and talking about this with their friends. And my daughter's part of a teenage group that has led some rallies. And I'm exhausted. And quite frankly, I feel like for the first time, you know, I could step aside. My 12-year-old and my 15-year-old got this, right? I really do feel that way. I also have to say that when it comes to our work with public defenders and COVID, what we have seen is when COVID hit, our jails and prisons were still packed, over 2 million people. And those prisons quickly and jails quickly became death traps. And public defenders were saying, this is inhumane. And people weren't listening. There were literally judges saying, COVID is not a change of circumstance. And public defenders didn't give up. They found ways to get the human stories before judges and prosecutors, and we started to see thousands of people released from jails and prisons. Now, far more need to be released, but that was because public defenders made sure that those stories were heard, and literally lives have been saved and people have been home. And what we've seen is the sky hasn't fallen. And so what I hope the takeaway is that people realize we can decarcerate. We can let many more people out of jails and prisons, and it's not the end of the world. So to me, public defenders have largely engineered a lot of that reduction in the jail population. The challenge for us now is how do we collectively come together and keep that mindset going, that we do not need to incarcerate so much and that it won't mean that the sky falls. So I'm optimistic. I think there are opportunities. I'm hopeful. And being on a panel with these wonderful folks, James and Lynn, who I work closely with, keeps me inspired. So thanks for letting me be a part of it, Tony.
The panel is pretty incredible, and I have a couple of minutes. So I'm gonna just pick on you, John, to hang in there with me on my one more systems change question, right? So, you know, in all the systems research, it says systems are changed in 3 ways. Either that the head of the system decides that they're going to be intentional and deliberate about changing what happens in their hierarchy. and they're going to work really hard every day to change it. Policy changes systems. Policy work that's behind the scenes creates laws, then changes some significant thing that happens, right? And then the activist who is there to lift up to the world, be transparent, hold a mirror up to what's happening, to call it out to the world. The activist also makes systems change, right? What role would you say, where do public defenders fall in those three categories of those who make systems change?
Yeah, all three. And let me tell you briefly why I say that. So at Gideon's Promise, we have multiple programs. Our core program is a 3-year program for new public defenders, and the idea is to shape their value system during those 3 most formative years. We have programs for supervisors, we have law school pipelines, but we also have a leadership program. And the leaders of the offices we work with get together every 6 months. And they're doing several things. One is they are very consciously thinking, what are the values that I need my organization to embrace? And what are strategies to get the people in my organization to embrace them? So leaders start the process of culture change by doing exactly what you say. They identify values and they find ways to shape people to live them. The second thing leaders and public defenders do is we think, what are the challenges in our own jurisdictions? And our leaders are very thoughtful about how they partner with judges, with county commissioners, with legislators to advocate for policy change that is so important to the communities we serve. And then the third piece, the activists, I think that we've really entered an era of public defense where the best public defender models recognize that they can't do this work if they're not in partnership with communities. An amazing community organizer named Raj Jayadev came up with a model called participatory defense. And he recognized that many communities don't trust public defenders, and many public defenders work in isolation of the people they serve. They're sort of like, I'm busy, don't call me, I've got to try to save you without you. And what Raj realized is they need to come together. And they're really, it started a model where the best public defender offices are building partnerships with communities so that public defenders are informed by communities about how they need to move in this space to support communities. And in turn, communities are exerting the power of the community to fight for their public defender offices that they see as their ally, their advocate, their champion. And very quickly in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, you may know, just earlier this year, 2 amazing public defenders were fired. 2 leaders in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania were fired because they were arguing that their system, their county, violated constitutional principles in their bail practice. They got fired. They have a participatory defense hub. The community rallied behind them, showed up at the county commissioners meeting, demanded they be replaced, and have for 4 months ever since fought for those 2 leaders to be restored to their job. That doesn't happen in a model where the community doesn't trust public defenders. That trust doesn't happen if public defenders don't recognize the importance of that alliance.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the panel. You know, on the Dallas County website, Lynn, on your website, there is a quote from Governor Roy Barnes, and it says, "The law should be a shield for the weak and the powerless, not a club for the powerful." And when I read that, I was really struck by how that should apply to philanthropy as well. Philanthropy should be a shield for the weak and the powerless, not a club for the powerful. And we have our own inventory to take on the philanthropic side as to how well we are doing that. So to the audience out there, if you want to join in this work, if this work is important to you, we invite you to join in our work with Social Venture Partners. We invite you to thank our panel today for their work that they do each and every day. And to the world of philanthropy who is doing this work and being a shield for the powerless and for the weak, we are grateful. I thank you all for being with us today, particularly to the esteemed panel, and I invite you back for our next session, which will be in a couple of weeks. Thank you all so very much. Take care. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.